There's a story about the novelist Dorothy Sayers. She wrote the Lord Peter Wimsey detective stories. And in her stories, Wimsey is brilliant, aristocratic, and very lonely. Readers noticed that as the series went on, Sayers introduced a new character, Harriet Vane, an Oxford-educated writer of detective fiction. In other words, someone remarkably like Sayers herself. And in the story, Harriet Vane becomes the one who loves Wimsey, rescues him emotionally, and saves him from himself. Now, some readers have suggested that Sayers wrote herself into the story to rescue her creation. She saw Wimsey's need and decided to fix it herself by becoming part of her own story. Now, whether or not that was Sayers' intention, it's a very powerful image, an author who steps inside their own creation to save it. The Bible has a very similar thing to teach us. The Gospel of John tells us that this world has an author, capital A, author. And at one point in human history, the author entered our story to dwell among us and rescue those he loved. And this month, as we're going through this Advent series of trying to understand why he came, why Jesus came into our world, today our answer is this. He came to dwell with us. That's why he came. He entered into our story to dwell with us. For our text, we're going to look at John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 and 14. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Let's take a minute to unpack these very theologically dense concepts that John is bringing to us. So when John is telling the Christmas story, so to speak, before he goes to the manger, John begins much higher, infinitely higher. In John 1:1, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." If you notice, John begins his gospel by deliberately echoing Genesis with the words, "in the beginning." And just as in Genesis, before creation, God exists, John makes the same claim. He says, before anything existed, the Word already was. Now, what does that mean, Word, that capital W word? What is the Word? Well, in Greek, it's the word logos or logos, depending on how you pronounce it. But what the Word is, it is God the Son from all eternity. It's another way of saying Jesus, like the pre-incarnate Jesus. It is the Son who shares the divine essence with the Father and the Spirit, the second person in the Trinity. That is the Word. And John writes about the creative power of the Word, the second part of the Trinity, in verse 3. He says, "All things were made through him, through the Word, and without him was not anything made that was made." Now that means every star, the Word spoke it into being. Every mountain, the Word shaped it. Every cell, every heartbeat, every atom, he designed it. And the galaxies that are so far away that the Hubble telescope cannot see them, he formed them. So if something exists, the Word made it. If something lives, the Word sustains it. Now, hold on to that idea for a moment, this idea of the eternal Word, because John, later in chapter 1, drops the most astonishing sentence ever put on paper. In John 1:14, he writes, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The eternal Word, the one who made everything, did what? John says he became flesh, fully human, fully like us, without any sin. So the Creator has become creature. The infinite has become infant. And the one whose presence filled up heaven takes up residence in a feeding trough. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, just as John used a special and loaded word to describe Jesus, he once again uses a very specific word to describe Jesus' existence on earth. He says that Jesus dwelt among us. And that word means he tabernacled among us. And if you're like, well, what does that mean? The literal translation is he pitched his tent among us. He went camping in the midst of us. Now, it might seem strange, the language of God camping in our midst, but it's a very clear Old Testament reference. In the Old Testament, there was a very famous tent called the tabernacle. And this tent was placed right in the center of Israel's camp. And in that tent, which was covered by cloud and fire, the presence of God dwelt in that tent, in a very special part of that tent. Now, John is making a parallel here. And when he uses that word that he tented or he camped or he tabernacled among us, John is saying that's what happened with Jesus. The author of the story, he pitched his tent in the middle of our camp. And he did it in more than canvas and poles. He did it in flesh and bones. So this is an astonishing thing. He became like us and dwelt, camped right in our very midst. Now, throughout history, many theologians have picked up on John's use of that word tabernacle or dwelling or camping. And they've pointed out that there's just numerous striking parallels between the tabernacle tent in the Old Testament and Jesus in his incarnation in the New Testament. We're just going to look at 4 briefly today. The first, the tabernacle was God's idea. Israel didn't think of the tabernacle or ask for it. They never said, hey, God, wouldn't it be great if you had a tent and you could kind of move around with us as we're wandering through the desert and then going into the promised land? It would sure be great if there was a place where we could come and meet you and you could be in our midst. No. God initiated it. God was the one who came to Israel and said, this is what we're going to do. This is the tabernacle. This is how I want you to build it. This is where I will dwell and reside among you. It's the same thing with Jesus. No one asked for Jesus to come. No, we didn't come up with the plans or the designs for it. It's all a matter of divine initiative. Jesus came from heaven to earth on his own. And we see this pattern that grace, it always starts with God moving towards us, God coming down to meet us. So the tabernacle and the incarnation, they're both God's idea. They're both grace-filled expressions of God's character. Second, the tabernacle looked very ordinary on the outside, but it was glorious on the inside. The tabernacle, it had this kind of a big curtain around it with poles, and then the kind of an inner courtyard with the actual tent inside. And from the outside, it wasn't very impressive. And there's actually modern day people have rebuilt it, and it's not that great to look at. It's not like like the Taj Mahal or St. Peter's and at the Vatican. But inside the tabernacle, it was pure gold. Once you got inside, it was on the interior. It was, especially where the presence of God was dwelt over this ark, which was this solid, pure gold. And there's this striking parallel, obviously, with the incarnation, that Christ too, outside he appeared very ordinary. Jesus was, if you saw him walking down the street, you would never think that was the Son of God. Isaiah's prophecy says there was no beauty about him that we should desire him. He wasn't big and tall and strong and handsome. He just was a very ordinary, plain looking person. And yet inwardly, on the inside, it was, we would say, pure gold. He had the radiance of the glory of God. There was even that moment of his transfiguration where this radiance, the glory kind of pours out. It kind of sneaks out there for a second. You could see this is what's really on the inside. So again, we see both in the tabernacle and in the incarnation of Jesus, it's very plain on the outside, but gloriously radiant and full of splendor on the inside. Third, the tabernacle traveled with the people. When they were in the wilderness or the desert and moving through when they got to the promised land, the tabernacle was not set apart in isolation. It wasn't like way like over there or up on a mountaintop, right? God's presence was not distant, and nor was it stationary. It moved with Israel wherever they went, through the desert, up the mountains, down the valleys, into battles. Wherever they went, so did the tent. So did God's presence go with them. And we see that in a way in the incarnation, that just as the tabernacle traveled throughout all of Israel's experiences, Jesus came into our world to enter the full journey of human life. Jesus didn't just remain above the fray and observe us for a distance. He fully entered into human existence, beginning with being a helpless baby, radically dependent on another for survival. And then through his life, he experiences hunger and fatigue and sorrow and temptation and grief and even death. So Jesus travels kind of through the entirety of the human experience. He knows everything what it is to be fully human. And then fourth, the tabernacle, ultimately its purpose was, it was a place where God met sinners. It was a place where God met sinners. Now, upon entering the tabernacle complex, once you got through kind of the outer walls, so to speak, the outer canvas fence, the first thing you saw was this large bronze-covered altar. And that was used for all these animal sacrifices and burnt offerings. And it symbolized very powerfully and very directly and very obviously that sinful people could not approach God directly. You could not go into the tent of meeting and you can't just casually stroll in. In order for priests to be able to enter, they first needed to offer a blood sacrifice to cover, or we would say atone, for their sin. That was a necessary first step before you could draw near into his presence. Now, we see the same in Jesus. It is in Jesus Christ where God meets sinners again, once and for all. Jesus is the place of meeting, and he is also the sacrifice that removes sin. Jesus did this on the cross. We know this story, right? That Jesus died on the cross to take away our sin so that we could draw near to God, so that we could draw near to. As we read in 1 Timothy 1:15, Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. And so we see in this just the totality of Jesus. Why John would choose this word dwelling and tabernacle and camping, because so many aspects of Jesus and his life are kind of all tied up in this. And what a remarkable, again, theologically loaded few sentences John has here for us. Kind of going back to where we started, Dorothy Sayers, she may or may not have written herself into her story. And that is still debated by literary scholars, whether she did or not. But John tells us that God clearly did. The eternal Word entered our world, took on our flesh, and pitched his tent among us. Not because we deserved it or because we asked for it, but because he loves the people he made, and we needed to be rescued. And only he could do it. And a final word of good news. He's still doing it. He is still doing it. When we come to faith in Jesus Christ, he dwells in us through his Spirit. And this is not just a metaphor. It's a real thing. He really starts camping. He takes residence inside of us. He tabernacles now within us. He also dwells with us through his written word. Jesus was the living word. This is his written word, and he is still today speaking to us. Hopefully, even in the last few minutes covering the verses from John, he is still speaking to us today. And he still dwells with us in the church. He is uniquely present in the gathering of his saints. And yet, we may be very flawed people, but yet the Lord makes his home here among us in his church. And we also know it's not just something he's doing now, dwelling among us. It's something that he has designed for all eternity. For the Bible ends with the great promise that the Lord will dwell with us forever in a new creation. Revelation 21:3 says, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." And what an incredible story we see here of what God has done, how he has written himself into our story, but not just for a chapter, but for all of it and into eternity. So why did he come? Because he wants to be with you. And the question that I think we need to wrestle with is, do we want to be with him? Do we want to be with him? And so I invite you, if you've not yet made that decision to come to Jesus and know him, that you would say yes to that in this moment. Do not delay. Your Lord has come. He has written himself into the story of your life so that you would know him, that you would put your trust in him, and that you would have everlasting life in and through him. So, brothers and sisters, say yes. Say yes to Jesus. And if so, please let us know. We want to come alongside you and help you to know, what does it mean to live with Jesus as he dwells in your presence. Amen.